He disrespected a war hero, unaware the hero's son was a Navy SEAL ready to settle the score. The smell of fresh coffee filled the small-town diner. Tables clinked, conversations murmured, and the morning rush created a gentle hum of life. In the corner, James Carter, a dignified black elderly man, quietly sipped his coffee. Every wrinkle on his face told a story of courage and resilience, memories of battlefields and years of service in the U.S. military. Enter Tommy "Tank" Malone, a local bully with a chip on his shoulder and a reputation for tormenting anyone he deemed weak. His eyes fell on James almost immediately. "Look at this guy," Tommy muttered to his friends, sitting there like he owns the place. The morning sun filtered through the diner's dusty windows, casting warm, muted light over the checkered tablecloths and the faint smell of fried eggs, bacon, and coffee. The quiet hum of conversation carried the usual morning rhythm, punctuated by the clatter of plates and the hiss of the espresso machine. James sat alone in a corner booth, his posture straight, hands resting over his cane. Despite his age, there was a disciplined aura about him, the kind that made people instinctively step back, even if they couldn't quite put their finger on why. His eyes, sharp and observant, scanned the room with a quiet awareness, noting every movement, every sound, and every intent. He wasn't just a man sipping coffee, he was a veteran, a soldier who had seen the worst of humanity and survived it, carrying a lifetime of discipline, strategy, and silent strength. Tommy, on the other hand, was everything James was not. Loud, brash, and unthinking, he thrived on the discomfort of others. A smirk danced across his face as he sauntered into the diner, his eyes scanning the room for someone to humiliate, someone to assert his meaningless dominance over. When he spotted James, sitting there alone, calm, quiet, and seemingly defenseless, his grin widened. He could almost taste the easy victory, the rush of power he would feel by tormenting an elderly man who probably wouldn't even fight back. He slid into the booth opposite James without asking, deliberately bumping the table with his elbow, causing a small tremor in the cup of coffee that steamed quietly in front of the veteran. "You look like you need a wake-up call," Tommy sneered, leaning back with exaggerated confidence. James's eyes didn't flicker. He didn't react. He just studied Tommy, assessing him in the way a seasoned fighter evaluates an opponent before a match. He had no doubt about this man's intent, no doubt about the arrogance, no doubt about the recklessness of the next move. He had been here before, in different countries, under different skis, facing opponents far more dangerous than this loud-mouthed fool, but his calm remained unwavering, his presence commanding. Tommy's fingers itched, as if guided by some inner instinct to cause chaos, and with a swift motion, he grabbed the cup of coffee in front of James. The diner seemed to hold its breath. Time slowed, almost imperceptibly, as the cup tilted and the dark liquid arced through the air, a steaming brown projectile destined for humiliation. The coffee splashed across James's lap with a suddenness that made a few nearby patrons flinch and gasp. The sound of liquid hitting fabric was sharp, startling, and final. For a brief moment, the diner went utterly silent, as if it collectively understood that this was a turning point, a moment when someone's true nature would reveal itself. James looked down at the mess. His clothes were soaked, the hot liquid burning slightly on his skin, but his face betrayed nothing. No flinch, no angered shout, no tremor of fear. His eyes, however, darkened slightly, sharpening like a hawk's, and the air around him seemed to thrum with restrained intensity. He placed one hand gently on the cane, the other resting calmly on the edge of the booth, and raised his gaze to meet Tommy. "Sir, Tommy started, a nervous laugh bubbling up as he thought the situation hilarious. He leaned back, smug, certain that the man before him would simply stew in silence, perhaps mumble something weakly, and then leave. The thrill of dominance coursed through him like electricity. He didn't see the storm brewing behind those calm, measured eyes. James's voice was low, steady, and measured, carrying an authority that seemed to resonate in the very air of the diner. "You're about to regret that." The words were soft, almost polite, but underneath them lay an unmistakable steel, a weight of consequence that no ordinary man could ignore. Every syllable was deliberate, calculated, and charged with a subtle menace that only those who have mastered both patience and precision can project. Tommy blinked, confused for the briefest of moments. He had expected fear, surprise, maybe anger, but not this quiet, immovable presence. He felt a shiver run down his spine, the tiniest crack in his overinflated ego, as he realized that he might have misjudged this man entirely. The diner seemed to shift. The clatter of dishes softened, the low murmur of conversation stilled. A waitress paused mid-step, her eyes wide, sensing the change in atmosphere, as if some invisible line had been crossed, a line where ordinary foolishness met a disciplined, lethal awareness. James's hand tightened subtly around his cane, and even in this civilian setting, there was a palpable tension, an unspoken message. Do not mistake silence for weakness. Tommy's smirk faltered. He laughed awkwardly, trying to mask the sudden unease that crept up his spine, but the sound lacked conviction, brittle and nervous. James remained seated, his posture unbroken, his gaze unwavering. His mind was already cataloguing the next moves, calculating probabilities, assessing outcomes, the precision of a soldier who had faced far more dangerous adversaries. The calmness of his demeanor was deceptive. Beneath it simmered the experience of decades, the resolve forged in conflicts that had demanded strategy, patience, and when necessary, swift, decisive action. Tommy leaned forward, attempting a bravado that no longer fit. Come on, old man, it was just a joke, lighten up. But James's eyes locked on his with a force that made the words falter before they left the mouth. There was no mockery in that gaze, no leniency, no doubt. It was a warning, unmistakable in its clarity, that some actions have consequences far beyond what the fool committing them might anticipate. The few patrons who had been watching exchanged glances, uncertain, sensing tension, but unable to articulate why. Something about James radiated authority, a quiet power, a presence that demanded recognition and respect. Tommy's laughter had died completely, replaced by a creeping uncertainty, a premonition that perhaps he had underestimated the wrong person. James finally moved, slowly, deliberately, reaching for a napkin to clean the spill on his lap. His movements were precise, economical, every motion betraying the control of someone who had trained both body and mind to act with purpose. He didn't shout, he didn't strike back, he didn't need to. His very presence communicated a lesson Tommy was only beginning to grasp. Power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it waits silently, like a coiled spring ready to release. Tommy, now sweating slightly, swallowed hard. He could feel the shift in the room, the weight of eyes upon him, sensing the growing realization that he had triggered a force far beyond his recklessness. The laughter, the smirk, the sense of superiority, all had evaporated in an instant. For the first time that morning, he questioned his judgment, the arrogance that had guided him into this moment, the hubris that had made him choose James as his target. James looked around the diner briefly, acknowledging the subtle glances of onlookers. There was no need for words. The message had been delivered. He returned his gaze to Tommy, voice still calm, steady, resonant with unspoken authority. Consider this a warning. The simmering tension hung in the air like smoke. Tommy's bravado faltered completely, replaced by the uneasy awareness that the simple act of spilling coffee had initiated a chain of events he was ill-prepared to confront. James, meanwhile, cleaned himself methodically, his posture unbroken, his demeanor composed, but the promise of retribution lingered subtly, a quiet storm waiting for the exact moment to strike. No one moved for a few seconds, the diner suspended in a strange liminal moment, until the gentle clinking of a dropped fork broke the spell. Tommy, his bravado shattered, muttered something unintelligible and slunk back into his seat, unsure how to recover from what he had done. James, calm as ever, adjusted his jacket, placed his hand once again on the cane, and finished his coffee, each sip deliberate, a quiet reaffirmation of his control over the moment, over the room, and over the fool who had thought to test him. By the time James left the diner, the incident had become a whispered legend among the patrons, a story of an ordinary morning disrupted by audacity, met with extraordinary composure, a subtle yet powerful reminder that some battles are won before a fist is thrown, and some men carry the weight of consequences long before they are enacted. The morning air outside the diner was crisp, carrying the faint scent of exhaust from nearby traffic and the subtle warmth of the late autumn sun. Marcus Carter jogged along the sidewalk, his uniform sweat still clinging to his skin from a grueling Navy SEAL training session at the base. Every muscle in his body moved with conditioned efficiency, honed through countless hours of drills, underwater swims, obstacle courses, and endurance runs. He was a man built for precision, strength, and tactical awareness. Yet despite the physical exhaustion, his mind was alert, scanning his surroundings instinctively, processing threats, reading patterns, and prioritizing actions. A ping from his phone cut through the rhythm of his run. Glancing at the screen, his heart skipped a beat at the message from his father. "Need you at the diner. Trouble." The word trouble alone was enough to send a surge of adrenaline coursing through his veins. He knew his father. Calm, unflappable, disciplined, a man who had survived the chaos of battlefields and returned with an inner steel few could match. But when James Carter called, there was no room for hesitation. Something serious was happening. Marcus adjusted his pace, sprinting the last few blocks, muscles firing with trained precision. His mind ran through possibilities, a confrontation, a threat, a physical altercation. He recalled every lesson drilled into him over years of training, assessed the environment, protect the objective, neutralize threats with efficiency. His father was the objective now, but more than that, Marcus felt the weight of family honor, the same honor that had been forged in James's years of service. As he approached the diner, the scent of brewed coffee and fried breakfast reached him, mixed with the faint, unmistakable tension that comes just before a confrontation. He slowed for only a second to assess. Outside, the parking lot was quiet, the usual morning bustle muted. He scanned the area, no immediate threat, but instinct told him that inside, something was unfolding that required his presence. Marcus pushed open the diner's door with practiced ease. The bell above jingled, but he barely registered it, his eyes locked instantly on the scene. His father, calm as ever, sat at a corner booth, the coffee incident clearly having occurred moments before. Across from him, Tommy slouched in his chair, attempting to mask the nervous tension Marcus could sense from his posture, the faint trembling in his hands, the darting eyes. Every subtle cue screamed danger mismanaged, fear attempting to hide behind bravado. Marcus's instincts, honed through years of Navy SEAL exercises designed to detect threats in milliseconds, were already cataloging Tommy's behavior, reading his intent, and preparing for immediate intervention. "Dad," Marcus's voice was low but carried authority, the kind that commanded attention without shouting, a vocal imprint of confidence and lethal skill. James looked up, his eyes meeting Marcus. No words were needed between them, the look alone communicated understanding, trust, and mutual recognition of the situation's gravity. James nodded once, almost imperceptibly, a simple gesture that carried decades of experience and quiet assurance. Marcus caught the subtle tension in his father's shoulders, the controlled restraint that indicated James had assessed the situation, knew the risks, and was already prepared for the next move, but wanted Marcus to be aware and ready. Marcus's gaze swept across the diner, taking in every detail in seconds. The scattered napkins, the half-full cup of coffee, the expressions of the few patrons who had frozen mid-bite, mid-conversation, and the way Tommy sat with a mixture of arrogance and fear, unaware that his actions had triggered a reaction far beyond his recklessness. Marcus's jaw tightened. Every fiber of his being demanded immediate correction of the imbalance of power, immediate restoration of respect, but he also knew the value of patience and observation. This wasn't just about a spilled cup of coffee. It was about asserting boundaries, teaching lessons, and making certain that consequences were understood by someone foolish enough to provoke a man like James Carter. Tommy's eyes widened as he recognized the sudden change in energy. He had assumed the old man's calm meant vulnerability, but now he felt a ripple of instinctive caution radiating from the corner booth. Marcus's presence was magnetic and intimidating, muscular, disciplined, and dangerous. Every movement Marcus made exuded controlled power, the way he adjusted the strap of his duffel bag, the subtle tightening of his fists at his sides, the scanning of the room as if memorizing exit routes and potential obstacles. Tommy's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of unease. He had not anticipated reinforcement, let alone reinforcement trained to operate under the highest levels of tactical stress. Marcus strode across the diner, deliberate, measured, each step quiet but forceful. Patrons instinctively moved their chairs slightly, sensing an invisible aura of authority, and even the cook paused mid-pour, spatula hovering in the air. Marcus reached the booth, stopping just short of the table, giving his father the space he needed while simultaneously making his presence undeniable. His eyes, sharp and commanding, never left Tommy, who now sat frozen in his chair, the earlier bravado completely evaporated. "You okay, Dad?" Marcus asked, his tone low, but carrying that unmistakable Navy SEAL authority. James nodded again, refusing to betray fear or irritation. His calmness contrasted sharply with the simmering tension in the room, reinforcing the message that his composure was a tool, not a weakness. Marcus's gaze returned to Tommy, piercing, calculating, evaluating. "Good," he said, jaw tightening, voice hardening with controlled intensity. "Some people need to learn respect." The words were simple, but their impact was amplified by the weight of presence, experience, and potential consequence behind them. Tommy swallowed audibly, unable to muster any response, fully aware that he had underestimated both father and son. He realized, with dawning horror, that the situation had escalated far beyond a simple act of juvenile cruelty. Marcus took a single, measured step closer. His posture was relaxed yet coiled, like a spring ready to release at a moment's notice. Every detail mattered: his proximity, his eye contact, the subtle shift of weight that communicated readiness without aggression. He wasn't there to attack yet. He was there to assert dominance, to set boundaries, to communicate in the language his adversary understood, through presence, precision, and unspoken threat. The diner itself seemed to hold its breath. Patrons watched in stunned silence as the dynamic shifted completely. The old man, stoic and disciplined, seated and calm, had summoned his son, trained, capable, and ready. The combination was formidable, a living testament to both experience and skill. Tommy, sensing the inevitability of consequences, tried to mask his fear with a weak laugh, but it lacked conviction, a brittle shield against the impending reckoning. Marcus's voice broke the silence again, measured, resonant, unwavering. "This isn't just about coffee, it's about respect. You chose poorly today." The words were simple, direct, and filled with the authority of someone who had been trained to act decisively, who had faced real threats and understood the cost of mistakes. Tommy's earlier sense of control dissolved completely. He realized he had not just disrespected a man, he had provoked a legacy, a force forged in discipline, combat, and unyielding principle. James rested a hand lightly on Marcus's forearm, a subtle signal of calm reassurance. Marcus nodded once, acknowledging the gesture, understanding that patience and measured action were now paramount. Together, they formed a silent alliance, the father-son bond amplified by years of shared discipline and mutual respect, standing as a living barrier against arrogance, ignorance, and foolishness. The diner remained tense, a frozen tableau of impending consequence, and in that charged silence, Tommy understood fully that some lessons are delivered not with words, but with presence, power, and the inevitability of skill tempered by honor. The diner had returned, superficially, to its usual morning rhythm, but the air was thick with tension, heavy enough to make each breath deliberate. The smell of coffee and bacon hung like a thin veil over the underlying storm that had just been unleashed. Tommy, emboldened by arrogance and ignorance, attempted to reclaim his dominance, his laugh echoing off the tiled walls with an artificial bravado. "You gonna cry now, Grandpa?" He sneered, tilting his chair back slightly, confident that the old man and his son could do nothing but sit there, humiliated and restrained. But the laughter died somewhere between the first syllable and the last as the room subtly shifted, the rhythm of the morning dissolving under the weight of what was about to happen. Marcus Carter had taken a measured step forward. His presence alone reshaped the space. Every patron sensed it instinctively. The diner seemed to shrink, walls closing in with the unspoken warning that they were witnessing something beyond the ordinary. Marcus's frame was imposing, not just because of sheer size and muscle, but because of the fluid, controlled energy that radiated from him, energy forged in sweat, blood, and relentless Navy SEAL training. His eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the room, noting the positions of patrons, the placement of tables and chairs, the exit points, and every subtle detail that could be leveraged if the situation escalated. Every breath he took was precise, every heartbeat synced with lethal intent. Tommy, for the first time, realized he was no longer playing with an old man or a helpless civilian. He was facing a predator, fully aware, fully capable, and ready to act with terrifying efficiency. "Back off," Marcus said, voice low, controlled, calm, but carrying a lethal undertone that resonated in the small diner. "Or you'll wish you had." The words were deliberate, an ultimatum wrapped in unshakable confidence. It was a warning that transcended language, the kind that only those who have honed instincts through real danger can project. Tommy's smirk faltered, the veneer of bravado cracking under the weight of immediate, tangible threat. The patrons, now acutely aware of the silent power in the booth, began to shift uneasily in their seats, sensing the invisible boundary Marcus had drawn. The tension was a living entity, coiling around Tommy, constricting his confidence, making every muscle twitch involuntarily. Tommy tried to laugh again, but it was forced, brittle, a weak shield against the rising storm. He shifted in his chair, rocking slightly and unconsciously gripping the edge of the table for balance, though the table itself offered no real protection. The coffee incident, once an act of thoughtless cruelty, now seemed trivial against the magnetic authority of the man standing before him. Marcus's eyes never left Tommy. Each movement was deliberate, each micro-expression catalogued. Marcus could see every flicker of fear, every hesitation, every subtle tick of someone accustomed to intimidation, yet suddenly exposed to a force far greater than himself. "Think you're funny?" Marcus continued, his tone unwavering. "Think you can humiliate people without consequences?" There was no aggression in the volume, only the natural authority of someone accustomed to commanding every situation, someone who had survived chaos where hesitation meant death. The simplicity of his words contrasted with the lethal potential behind them. Every syllable carried weight, every pause a silent echo of the disciplined violence that Marcus could unleash if needed. Tommy's jaw tightened, his chair creaking slightly under the subtle shift of weight as he leaned back instinctively, trying to regain composure. But it was futile. He could feel the air thickening, a heavy, almost tactile tension that seemed to press against his chest, slowing his breath. Marcus was closing no physical distance yet, but the psychological distance had already been annihilated. Tommy's earlier confidence, the mask he had worn so effortlessly, was crumbling under the invisible pressure of discipline, precision, and lethal preparedness. James, seated calmly in the booth, observed silently, his hand resting lightly on his cane. He didn't need to intervene. His presence and the trust in his son's judgment was enough to stabilize the situation and allow Marcus to convey the necessary warning. His eyes flicked from Tommy to Marcus, acknowledging the way his son managed tension with surgical precision. There was no fear, no impulsive rage, only the strategic application of presence. Tommy had triggered the wrong family, challenged the wrong man, and now, more importantly, was being evaluated and contained by someone trained to deal with unpredictability and aggression. Marcus took another step forward, controlled, each movement deliberate. His body language radiated readiness without aggression, strength without recklessness. The small shift brought him closer to Tommy, not to strike yet, but to occupy the psychological space, to assert dominance without a word. Every patron in the diner now watched, transfixed, recognizing the predator and prey dynamic playing out silently before their eyes. Tommy's smirk had vanished completely, replaced by a twitching nervousness, a rapid heartbeat audible in his own ears, though the room remained quiet. He had never faced this level of presence, this perfect fusion of muscle, mind, and will. "You don't get to disrespect people," Marcus continued, his voice almost a whisper but cutting through the room like a blade. "Not my dad, not anyone in this diner, not without consequences." The words were deliberate, calculated, the kind that linger long after they are spoken. Tommy swallowed hard, realizing that the consequences were immediate, unavoidable, and potentially devastating. The heat rising in his chest was no longer embarrassment alone. It was the primal awareness of danger, of someone who could dismantle his bluff without touching him, whose skill and readiness rendered his intimidation meaningless. Marcus paused, scanning the diner one last time. Patrons leaned forward, curious and fearful, sensing the tightrope between civility and chaos. The room seemed to shrink further, tables and chairs fading into the periphery as all attention centered on the silent battle of wills unfolding in the corner booth. Tommy's hands shook slightly now, a subconscious acknowledgement that the situation had escalated beyond control. Marcus didn't move aggressively. He didn't need to. His mere posture, his unwavering eye contact, his measured proximity conveyed a lethal promise that words alone could never fully express. Finally, Marcus exhaled slowly, a subtle display of controlled dominance. "This is your only warning," he said, every word a precise instrument of deterrence. "Leave my dad alone, or things will get very unpleasant for you." Tommy's mind raced. He had underestimated the situation, misjudged the threat, and now felt the full weight of his mistake. The earlier laughter, the smug arrogance, the assumption of control, all gone, replaced by raw, instinctive fear. Marcus's presence alone had neutralized the immediate threat without a single strike, a living testament to skill, discipline, and the power of composed authority. The diner remained tense for a heartbeat longer, then the subtle clink of a dropped fork punctuated the spell, grounding the patrons back in reality. Tommy slouched slightly, defeated, aware that he had been bested before any physical confrontation had occurred. Marcus gave him one final, piercing glance, ensuring the lesson was understood, then took a deliberate step back, returning to his father's side. James's hand rested on Marcus's arm, a quiet gesture of pride and reassurance. The confrontation was over, though the impression it left would linger far longer, an indelible lesson about respect, presence, and the cost of foolish arrogance. The diner had returned to its ordinary hum of clattering dishes and quiet conversation, but the air around the corner booth remained electrified, charged with an invisible tension that seemed to press against the walls and ceiling. Tommy sat frozen, his body rigid, the earlier bravado evaporated entirely, replaced by a growing, instinctive fear. Every breath he took was shallow, rapid, betraying the panic he could no longer suppress. Marcus Carter, standing beside his father, radiated an aura that was both disciplined and dangerous, a perfect balance of calm authority and latent violence that no ordinary man could mistake. His muscles, toned and honed from relentless Navy SEAL training, were relaxed yet coiled, like a predator ready to strike, and every micro-expression on his face communicated the lethal precision of someone accustomed to controlling life-and-death situations with a single measured movement. Marcus didn't attack, not physically, not yet. That wasn't necessary. The moment he had arrived, the dynamic had already shifted irreversibly. Tommy's assumption that strength and aggression alone could dominate had been shattered in the face of quiet, controlled power. The lesson had begun without a sound, without a blow, and the impact was already reverberating through every fiber of Tommy's being. He could feel it, a subtle, pervasive pressure that seemed to radiate from Marcus, a psychological force more effective than any fist, any threat, any display of violence. It was a power born of discipline, training, and the unshakable confidence that comes from surviving unimaginable situations and emerging victorious. Marcus leaned in slowly, just enough for his voice to be intimate, measured, and undeniably threatening, yet still calm, almost conversational. His words, whispered with precision, carried the weight of consequence without raising the volume, each syllable deliberate. "Do that again," he murmured, close enough that Tommy could feel the warmth of his breath, "and I won't just tell you what respect means." There was no overt threat of immediate violence, but the implication was clear, inescapable. Marcus could end this situation utterly, if necessary, and Tommy would not survive the mistake a second time. The impact of those few words was instantaneous. Tommy's mind raced, his earlier cockiness dissolving completely as he realized the depth of danger he now faced. He had assumed he was dealing with a defenseless elderly man, perhaps someone who would grumble and retreat, someone he could intimidate with a sneer and a shove. Instead, he was confronted by not only the calm authority of James Carter, but also the lethal presence of his son, a man whose very posture, measured steps, and controlled breathing screamed competency and deadly skill. The realization struck him with visceral force. He had miscalculated entirely. He was outmatched, outclassed, and utterly exposed, a fact that sank into him like a lead weight pressing against his chest. James, seated calmly and unperturbed, observed the interaction with the serene authority of a man who had seen the worst the world could offer and emerged unbroken. His hands rested lightly on his cane, the embodiment of composed strength, and his eyes, sharp and discerning, followed Marcus's every subtle movement. Finally, after ensuring that the immediate threat had been neutralized psychologically, James spoke, his voice calm, resonant, and full of authority that carried naturally through the diner. Son and father, respect is earned, not stolen. The words hung in the air, simple yet profound, and the diner seemed to hold its collective breath as the truth of the statement resonated. Every patron who had been watching now understood that they had witnessed a rare lesson, a real confrontation in which words, presence, and discipline conveyed more power than any impulsive act of violence could. Tommy's face drained of color as the meaning of James's words sank in. He had not just disrespected an old man or provoked a random stranger. He had attempted to steal respect by force, and he had failed spectacularly. The lesson was clear, undeniable, and permanent. Marcus straightened, stepping back slightly, though his gaze never left Tommy. The controlled restraint in his posture was deliberate. He had demonstrated the threat, conveyed the consequences, but had chosen mercy over immediate violence. That restraint, that decision to communicate dominance without striking, amplified the psychological impact. Tommy could feel it, a tightening in his chest, a cold realization that this was not just a warning, but a glimpse of what discipline, skill, and honor combined could accomplish if ignored. James continued, his tone even steady, authoritative, as if delivering a fundamental truth that extended beyond the confines of the diner. Some people think disrespect is a tool, a way to assert power over others. But power is meaningless if it is stolen through fear, mockery, or cruelty. True authority comes from integrity, from strength tempered by wisdom, and from the courage to face consequences without flinching. His eyes swept across the diner briefly, acknowledging the patrons who had been silently watching, reinforcing the gravity of the lesson. Marcus understands that, I understand that, and now, so do you. Tommy's hands trembled slightly as he clutched the edge of the table, a futile attempt at grounding himself in the reality that his confidence had evaporated. He had underestimated everything: the composure of James Carter, the lethal precision of his son, the invisible but palpable authority that could control a room without a single blow. He had been taught, in the harshest possible way, that arrogance, cruelty, and thoughtless aggression carry consequences far beyond what he had imagined. Marcus exhaled slowly, his posture relaxing just enough to signal that the immediate lesson had been delivered, yet leaving enough tension that Tommy understood the consequences of testing boundaries again. There was no need for further action. The message had been received, etched into Tommy's awareness with a clarity and permanence that could not be ignored. The balance of the situation had been restored, respect asserted, and authority acknowledged, all without a single act of physical violence. James leaned back slightly in his chair, a faint, approving smile crossing his features, subtle but unmistakable. He had witnessed the seamless execution of a difficult lesson, the use of presence, control, and psychological dominance to neutralize a threat while maintaining moral authority. The father and son exchanged a brief, silent glance, an unspoken acknowledgement of understanding, pride, and shared discipline. Their bond, forged through years of life, training, and mutual respect, had been reaffirmed in the crucible of this moment. The diner, still quiet, slowly returned to its usual rhythm, though the memory of what had transpired lingered in every corner, every glance, every pause in conversation. Tommy sat slumped, defeated, the weight of the lesson pressing down on him, knowing that he had been bested not through brute force, but through a combination of skill, presence, and calculated authority. Marcus and James gathered their things calmly, ready to leave, the lesson complete, leaving behind an indelible impression on the bully, the patrons, and the very air of the diner itself, a testament to the power of discipline, respect, and measured action. Tommy stumbled backward, face pale, fear finally replacing arrogance. He mumbled apologies, backing out of the diner like a beaten animal. The patrons whispered among themselves, even the waitress shook her head, impressed. James cleaned up, sighing. "You see, Marcus, some lessons don't need fists." Marcus smiled faintly, "Some just need presence." The rest of the morning passed quietly. Patrons offered nods of respect to James and Marcus. The bully never returned. Word spread quickly in town, "Don't mess with James Carter or his son." Marcus and James left the diner together, proud and unshaken, father and son walking side by side, the bond stronger than any threat. The lesson lingered. True courage isn't about fighting, it's about commanding respect without striking and acting decisively when necessary.